The classroom was supposed to be a place of learning, a space where knowledge transcended boundaries of race, class, and background. But on this particular morning in a quiet college town, that illusion was about to be shattered in front of dozens of watchful eyes. It began like any other day, students filing in, chatting, adjusting backpacks and notebooks, trying to shake off the drowsiness of early lectures. Among them was a young black student named David, who had worked harder than most just to be there. For him, education wasn't just a right, it was a victory. Every step he took across campus echoed with the footsteps of his ancestors, who had been denied such opportunities. Sitting in that classroom wasn't simply about earning credits. It was about honoring the sacrifices of those who had paved the way. David had a routine. He sat in the same seat every day, near the window where sunlight spilled in, allowing him to gather his thoughts while listening to the professor. That desk had become a small sanctuary, his space to learn, to think and to breathe. But on this day, when he walked into the room, he froze. A man he didn't recognize was sitting at his desk. At first, David thought little of it. Students sometimes shifted around, but as he approached politely offering a friendly nod, he could feel something cold in the man's stare. "Excuse me," David said, his voice calm, respectful. "This is where I usually sit. Would you mind moving over?" The man leaned back in the chair, a smirk forming on his lips. He wasn't a student David recognized, and his age suggested he was older than the rest of the class. Something about his demeanor radiated arrogance, a stubborn challenge. "What's the problem?" the man drawled, his tone heavy with disdain. "A desk is a desk. You can sit anywhere, can't you?" David tried again, still composed. "I understand, but I usually sit here. It helps me focus. I'd appreciate it if—" But before he could finish, the man cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "Listen, kid, don't start telling me where I can and can't sit. You don't own this place." His words were laced with something more venomous than simple defiance. His eyes narrowed, his lips curled. The hostility was unmistakable. And then he said it, loud enough for those around them to hear. "You people always think you're entitled to something." The words sliced through the air like glass. Conversations in the room faltered. Heads turned. The subtle hum of morning chatter died into silence. David felt the sting immediately. Not just the insult itself, but the weight of its history, the centuries of prejudice compacted into that one sentence. He stood still, his chest tight, while the man leaned forward, daring him to push back. David could have reacted in anger. Many in his place would have. But he remembered something his grandmother used to tell him when he was a boy. Strength isn't just in your voice, it's in your restraint. Dignity always wins louder than rage. With those words echoing in his mind, David steadied himself. "Sir," he replied, his voice even but firm, "this isn't about entitlement. It's about respect." The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made a few students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Respect? Don't lecture me about respect. I've been around a lot longer than you. I'll sit wherever I damn well please." For a moment, David considered letting it go. He could have walked to another seat, avoided confrontation, but something in him refused. Why should he, the one disrespected, be the one to move? Why should the burden of peace always fall on the shoulders of the disrespected? His silence would not teach the man anything, nor would it honor himself. So David did something unexpected. He calmly set his books down on the desk in front of the man and said, "I'll wait." The class stirred. The professor, who had just entered the room, stopped mid-step, sensing the tension. Eyes darted back and forth between David and the man, the air heavy with anticipation. The man sneered. "You'll wait, huh? You think I'm just gonna get up because you tell me to?" But David didn't answer. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply stood there, tall and unwavering, his silence more powerful than any words he could have spoken. His stance said everything. "I belong here. You cannot move me without exposing yourself for what you are." Minutes passed. The professor, realizing what had been said, stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" he asked carefully. David turned to him respectfully. "Professor, I've sat here every day since the start of the semester. This gentleman refuses to move, and he made comments that were inappropriate." The professor's eyes hardened as he glanced at the man. "Is that true?" The man shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the room full of eyes watching him. For the first time, the arrogance cracked. "I don't see what the big deal is," he muttered, his voice losing some of its earlier bite. "It's just a desk." But the damage was already done. The students had heard his words. They had seen his contempt. Whispers began spreading across the room. Murmurs of disbelief, of disgust. One young woman spoke up, her voice sharp. "We all heard what you said. You disrespected him. That's not just a desk, that's racism." The man's face reddened. He tried to defend himself, but the weight of the stairs silenced him. The professor stepped closer, his tone firm. "In this classroom, respect is non-negotiable. If you cannot extend it, you have no place here." Reluctantly, the man stood, his bravado collapsing under the pressure of accountability. He shoved his chair back with a loud scrape, muttering under his breath as he grabbed his bag. But before leaving, he threw one last glance at David, a look that was meant to be defiant but came out hollow, weak. David, however, did not gloat. He did not smirk in victory or meet arrogance with arrogance. Instead, he simply sat down in his seat, opened his notebook, and prepared for class as if nothing had happened. That act alone, quiet, dignified, unshaken, was the most powerful answer he could give. As the man stormed out, the professor turned to David. "Thank you for handling that with grace," he said softly. David nodded. He didn't feel victorious. He felt the weight of what had just occurred. But he also felt something else, pride. Not pride in humiliating another, but pride in standing firm without compromising his dignity. What the man failed to realize was that in refusing to move from that desk, he had revealed more about himself than about David. His racism had been laid bare for everyone to see, and in the end, it was he who had been forced to move, not by force or threat, but by the undeniable power of truth, respect, and dignity. That day became more than just another lecture. For every student who witnessed it, it was a lesson about courage, about how silence can be stronger than shouting, about how dignity can dismantle hatred without ever lowering itself. And for David, it was another chapter in a much larger story, the story of resilience in the face of prejudice and the quiet victories that shaped the fight for justice. When the door slammed behind the man, the room lingered in silence for a moment, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. The professor cleared his throat, trying to restore order. "All right, everyone, let's get started." His tone was steady, but the atmosphere was heavy. The students weren't just thinking about the lecture. They were replaying the moment in their minds, the way venom had dripped from the man's words, and the way David had refused to bend under it. David sat quietly, his pen resting on the page. Though he hadn't written a single word yet, he could feel eyes glancing at him from every direction, some filled with admiration, others with discomfort. Being the center of attention wasn't something he wanted. All he had wanted that morning was to sit in his usual seat and take notes. But life for Black students, and for Black people in general, often didn't allow for the simplicity of just wanting. There was always a reminder, always a test, always some moment where dignity had to be defended. After class, a few students approached him. One young man, nervous but sincere, said, "Hey, I just wanted to say, the way you handled that it was powerful. I don't think I could have kept that calm." A young woman nodded in agreement. "You didn't even have to raise your voice." He exposed himself for what he was. "You showed all of us what strength really looks like." David smiled faintly, appreciating their words but still weighed down by the incident. He thanked them, gathered his things, and walked across campus. The crisp air hit his face, but it didn't clear his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the man, someone who wasn't even part of their class, barging in, spewing hate and believing he could get away with it. And in many ways, David knew why. Because men like him had gotten away with it for so long. Later that day, word of the incident spread across campus. Social media posts began to circulate. Some students had recorded parts of it, capturing the man's sneer and his cutting words. "You people always think you're entitled to something." The clip traveled fast, shared among students, then beyond the campus. Comments poured in, some expressing outrage, others expressing support for David, and a few, predictably, defending the man with excuses. But no matter how people spun it, the video made one thing clear. The man had revealed his prejudice openly, and David had met it with calm defiance. By evening, the university administration had released a statement condemning the incident. They emphasized their commitment to diversity and respect, pledging to investigate how someone unaffiliated with the class had been allowed to intrude in the first place. For once, the system seemed to be responding quickly, but David didn't need statements or promises to know what had truly mattered. What had mattered was the choice he made in the moment, to stand tall without being dragged into the ugliness thrown at him. That night, David sat in his dorm room, the glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across his notebook. He picked up his pen and began to write, not class notes, Not an assignment, but his feelings. Writing was his way of making sense of the world, of giving shape to the emotions that pressed against his chest. He wrote about how that desk wasn't just wood and screws, but a place of belonging. He wrote about how racism always tried to shrink people down, to make them move, to make them step aside. And he wrote about why he chose not to move, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. As he wrote, he remembered his grandmother's words again. She had grown up in the South where segregation had been law, not just attitude. She had told him stories of riding in the back of buses, of drinking from colored fountains, of being told constantly that she didn't belong. Yet she had raised her head high, refusing to let shame define her. One day, she had told David when he was young, you'll face moments where people will try to put you in the back seat, to remind you of a place they think you belong. When that day comes, remember, your place is exactly where you stand. David smiled sadly at the memory. That day had come, and he had remembered. Over the next week, students continued to bring up the incident. In class discussions, professors used it as a teaching moment about prejudice and respect. Student organizations reached out to David, inviting him to speak about his experience. At first, he hesitated. He didn't want to be turned into a symbol or have his pain turned into a spectacle. But he realized that telling his story wasn't just about him. It was about every student who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was about refusing to let silence bury the truth. So he agreed. And when he stood before a room full of students at a campus forum, he spoke, not with bitterness, but with clarity. What happened to me wasn't just about a desk. It was about dignity. Too often, people like me are asked to move, to step aside, to make space for disrespect. That's the unspoken demand. Keep quiet. Don't cause trouble, just take another seat. But I need you all to understand something. Our presence here is not negotiable. We belong, and when you belong, you don't give that up because someone else is uncomfortable with it. His words were met with silence at first, then applause that grew louder, filling the room. Students stood, clapping not just for David, but for the truth he spoke. Some wiped tears from their eyes, feeling seen in his courage. The man who had refused to move from David's desk never returned to campus. Rumor had it he was confronted by administrators and told not to come back. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe he didn't. But his attempt to belittle another had backfired. Instead of humiliating David, he had exposed himself and ignited conversations that were bigger than either of them. His cruelty had been the match, but David's dignity had been the fire that spread. Weeks later, when David walked back into that same classroom, he noticed something small but profound. The desk by the window, the one he had fought for, was untouched. Students seemed to leave it for him, as if it had been marked by what had happened. Not because it was his in the literal sense, but because it represented something now. It represented the refusal to move in the face of disrespect. It represented quiet strength. David sat down, opened his notebook, and for the first time in a long while, felt a sense of peace. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced prejudice. Life had taught him that already. But he also knew something even stronger, that no matter how many times it came, he carried within him the power to face it, to stand firm, to never let someone else decide where he belonged. In the end, the story wasn't about a racist man who refused to move. It was about a young black student who refused to be moved. And in that refusal, in that quiet insistence on dignity, there was a lesson not just for the classroom, but for life. That respect isn't given by those who try to withhold it. It's claimed by those who live it, who embody it and who refuse to surrender it. David's story became one of those whispered across campus for years to come. Freshmen heard about it from seniors. Professors referenced it when discussing courage and justice. And long after graduation, when David looked back on his college years, he wouldn't remember that man's sneer or his hateful words. He would remember the silence he chose, the stand he took, and the power of dignity that turned one man's cruelty into a campus's awakening. And somewhere, deep within, he would hear his grandmother's voice again. Your place is exactly where you stand. Years passed, and the memory of that day in the classroom still lived quietly in David's heart. What had begun as a moment of confrontation between one man and one student had grown into something larger, a lesson that traveled with him wherever he went. Life after graduation pulled David into new arenas, but the principles he had carried that morning, the refusal to surrender dignity, the decision to stand firm, remained his compass. After college, David entered the professional world. He worked in a corporate office, an environment filled with polished smiles and polite words that sometimes concealed unspoken prejudice. Racism didn't vanish just because suits and ties replaced backpacks and textbooks. It appeared in smaller ways. A colleague dismissing his ideas until someone else repeated them. A client assuming he wasn't in charge. Whispers about how he had gotten opportunities because of diversity quotas. Each instance was a reminder of how prejudice adapts, how it seeps into spaces quietly. But David remembered the desk. He remembered that standing his ground didn't always require loud battles, it required presence. So when he was interrupted in meetings, he calmly reclaimed his words. When others doubted his authority, he proved it with excellence. And when he felt the weight of isolation pressing on him, he thought of his grandmother's voice. Your place is exactly where you stand. One day, during a leadership retreat, David was asked to share a defining moment from his past that shaped who he was. Most people talked about internships, mentors, or achievements. David paused, then spoke about the classroom. He told the story, not with anger, but with quiet conviction. By the time he finished, the room was hushed. His colleagues looked at him differently, not just as a co-worker, but as someone who had faced the ugliness of the world and chosen dignity over defeat. Afterwards, several people approached him, confessing their own stories of discrimination, of being silenced, of feeling invisible. For the first time, David realized how far-reaching his moment of resistance could go. His story was not just about race, it was about humanity, about anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the years unfolded, David married, became a father, and built a life rooted in both ambition and principle. When his children were old enough, he shared the story with them. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, he leaned across to his eldest daughter and said, "One day someone will try to make you feel small, to push you aside. And you'll have a choice, step back or stand tall. I want you to remember, you belong. Don't ever let anyone move you from your place." His daughter listened wide-eyed, the story sinking into her young heart like a seed planted deep in fertile soil. Meanwhile, the story of that classroom encounter never truly faded from the public eye. Former classmates had carried it into their own lives, retelling it as an example of courage. One student became a teacher and used the story in lessons on social justice. Another became a journalist and wrote an article years later titled, "The Day a Student Refused to Move." That article spread widely, resonating with readers across backgrounds. The internet rediscovered the video clip. And once again, David's calm defiance found its way into timelines and news feeds. Strangers wrote messages. "Thank you for showing us how to handle hate with dignity." Others said, "I faced something like this, and I remembered your story. It gave me strength." David was humbled. He had never asked for this role, but life had given it to him, and he embraced it with responsibility. Eventually, David was invited to speak at a national conference on racial equity. Standing before thousands, he reflected not just on that single day, but on everything it represented. That desk, he said, wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has ever been asked to move, to shrink, to disappear so that someone else's comfort could remain untouched. When we refuse to move, we are saying we belong, not because the world allows us, but because dignity is ours by right. The audience rose to its feet, clapping not for a polished speech, but for a truth they felt in their bones. In time, David's story was taught in classrooms, not just as an anecdote, but as a living example of quiet resistance. His name became tied to a principle, that sometimes the most radical act of courage is the refusal to be erased. His children grew up hearing their classmates whisper, "That's David's daughter, the one whose dad stood up in that classroom," and instead of embarrassment, they felt pride. But perhaps the greatest testament to the legacy of that moment came many years later, when David was invited back to his old university to deliver a commencement address. As he walked onto the stage in his cap and gown as an honorary speaker, the memories of his younger self flooded back. He could almost see the sunlight spilling across the desk by the window, could almost hear the venom in the man's voice. He looked out at the graduating students and began, "Years ago, in one of these classrooms, a man tried to make me feel like I didn't belong. He sat in my seat, mocked me, and told me that my people were entitled. But I didn't move. I stayed where I was, not with anger, but with dignity. That day changed me. And I want you to carry this with you into the world. Wherever you go, there will be those who try to make you step aside, who try to shrink your worth. Don't move. Stand in your place with dignity, because you belong, always." The crowd erupted, but David didn't bask in applause. He simply smiled, knowing the words were no longer his. They belonged to every student, sitting before him, and to every person who would face their own moment of decision. When he stepped down from the stage, he passed by the classroom where it had all begun. The desk was still there. It had been replaced and polished over the years, but to David, it carried the memory of a stand that became a lesson that became a story, and a story that became a legacy. The racist man who had refused to move was forgotten by history, but the young black student who had refused to be moved had become part of it. His dignity had outlived hatred. His story had become a light for others, and that, perhaps, was the deepest justice of all. Because in the end, dignity doesn't just defend itself, it multiplies. It inspires, it teaches, and it lives on. And so the lesson remains as powerful today as it was on that morning in the classroom. When hate demands you step aside, let your answer be steady, quiet, unshaken, I will not move. Years after David gave his commencement address, the story of the desk had spread so widely that it had taken on a life of its own. Universities referenced it in lectures on civil rights. Churches used it in sermons about dignity and faith. Community leaders spoke of it when rallying people to stand against injustice. What had once been a quiet standoff in a single classroom had grown into a parable of resilience, carried on lips and in hearts across the country. David himself often marveled at how the story traveled. Strangers would stop him in airports, shaking his hand and saying, "You taught me not to move." Others sent letters from across the world, sharing their own stories of discrimination and how they had remembered his example. Each time, David was humbled. He had never sought fame, never wanted to be known for confrontation. All he had done was stand still. Yet sometimes the smallest stands are the ones that change lives. But with recognition came responsibility. David realized his life was no longer just his own. He was now a steward of a lesson bigger than himself. So he poured himself into service. He worked with youth programs, mentoring black students, who were often told directly or indirectly that they didn't belong in certain spaces. He visited high schools and underfunded neighborhoods, standing before classrooms full of young people and telling them, no matter what the world says, your place is yours. Don't surrender it. One day, after a talk at a community center, a young boy lingered behind as the others left. He looked nervous, his backpack hanging low on his shoulders. Finally, he walked up to David and said softly, "At school, they tell me I should sit in the back. They laugh when I sit in the front. What should I do?" David knelt so his eyes were level with the boys. "You sit in the front," he said gently. "And when they laugh, you remember this? Courage doesn't come from following the crowd. It comes from knowing your worth. You belong in the front as much as anyone. Don't move." The boy nodded, his small face determined. That moment reminded David why his story mattered. Not for headlines, not for applause, but for children who needed to see themselves as worthy of every seat, every space, every opportunity. As the years passed, David's children grew into adults. His daughter, inspired by his story, became a lawyer, fighting for educational equity. His son became a teacher, determined to create classrooms where no child ever felt they didn't belong. At family gatherings, when the younger cousins asked why people always spoke of the desk, David would smile and let his children answer. They explained with pride, knowing that their father's stand was now part of the family's inheritance, a story passed down like a treasured heirloom. But the story's reach extended even further. A documentary filmmaker learned of David's experience and decided to capture it on screen. The film wove his story into the broader history of resistance, connecting his act of quiet defiance to the long chain of black resilience, from Rosa Parks refusing to move on a bus, to students who had once sat bravely at lunch counters during sit-ins. The film was released nationally, and David's story reached millions. Audiences wept, applauded, and carried the lesson home with them. In interviews, David often downplayed his role. "I wasn't trying to make history," he said. "I was just trying to keep my dignity." History has a way of writing itself when you live in truth. Yet even as the world celebrated him, David never forgot the man, the one who had sparked it all with his cruelty. Sometimes, late at night, David wondered what had become of him. Had he changed? Had he ever felt regret? Or had he carried his bitterness to the end? David would never know. But what comforted him was the thought that the man's hate had been temporary, but his own dignity had been eternal. When David entered his later years, he began to write a memoir. The title was simple, I Didn't Move. In it, he told not just the story of the classroom, but the story of his journey, of growing up, of his grandmother's wisdom, of the ways racism tried to push him aside, and of the ways he resisted with quiet strength. The book became a bestseller, taught in schools and cherished in homes. Generations read his words and found courage in them. On the day of the book's release, David spoke at a packed auditorium. He looked out over the crowd, children, parents, elders, activists, teachers, and felt tears press against his eyes. "This story began with a desk," he said softly. "But it was never about the desk. It was about us. About every one of us who is told to move, who is told we don't belong. The truth is, dignity isn't something anyone can give or take. It's ours. And the moment you decide not to move, you claim it forever." The audience rose in thunderous applause, many in tears. Parents held their children close, whispering that they too must never move. In the years that followed, David's health began to decline. But his influence never did. His story lived on in books, in films, in speeches, in the hearts of those who had been changed by it. And when he finally passed, his funeral was filled with thousands who came to honor not just a man, but a principle. His casket was draped not in symbols of wealth or power, but with a simple inscription: he refused to move. At the service, his daughter spoke through tears. "My father taught us that dignity doesn't shout, it stands. It stands when others try to push you aside. It stands when hate tries to shrink you. It stands so that generations after can walk taller. Today, we don't mourn him, we rise with him. And we promise in his memory that we too will never move." And so the story of one young black student, who once simply stood beside a desk in defiance of hate, became timeless. His stand was not loud, not violent, not dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to change the lives of those who witnessed it. Enough to ripple across generations. Enough to remind the world of a truth too often forgotten: that when dignity stands still, hate cannot move it. David's story became part of the great mosaic of history, woven alongside all those who had refused to bend, refused to bow, refused to disappear. And long after his name faded into memory, the lesson remained, alive in every child, every student, every person facing their own test: do not move. You belong. Years after David's passing, the world had changed in many ways, but the struggle against discrimination was far from over. His story, however, had become a beacon. Schools across the nation began teaching the desk story in history and social studies classes, not as a tale of one man's defiance alone, but as a universal lesson about dignity, courage, and justice. Children would sit in classrooms, listening intently as teachers described how one student's refusal to move had reshaped the conversation about belonging. And when asked what they learned, many would say that our place matters. At one high school in Atlanta, a teacher named Mrs. Rivers made David's story a yearly ritual. Every September, on the first day of class, she told her students about him. But she didn't just speak, she acted it out. She would take a desk from the back and set it at the front. Then she would ask a student to sit down. Inevitably, another student, playing the antagonist, would be told to demand the seat. The classroom always went quiet during this reenactment, and when the student in the chair refused to move, the lesson landed harder than any lecture. "You see," Mrs. Rivers would say, her voice soft but firm, "the desk is not just furniture. It is your right to belong. Never let anyone take that from you." Her students carried the lesson with them beyond the classroom. One of them, a young girl named Amina, faced bullying for wearing her natural hair at school. She remembered the story, remembered David's courage, and refused to bow to pressure. Years later, she became a lawyer, advocating against discriminatory policies in schools, policies that punished black students disproportionately. When asked what inspired her, she smiled and said, "The story of the desk. It taught me to stay seated in my truth." In another part of the country, a community center in Detroit adopted David's mantra, "Don't move," as its motto. Painted in bold letters across the wall, it greeted every child who entered the building. The center became a place of refuge for young people who felt pushed aside by society. Mentors would remind them daily, "This is your place. You don't need permission to exist." And for countless children, that affirmation was life-changing. But David's influence didn't stop at classrooms or community centers. His story began to inspire movements. College students, organizing against systemic inequality, invoked his name in their speeches. Protesters marching for racial justice held signs that read, "We won't move." Artists created murals of a young, black student sitting at a desk, face resolute, eyes unflinching, surrounded by the words of his grandmother, "Stand tall. Never move from your dignity." In time, David's story transcended racial lines, resonating with people across the globe who faced their own struggles against oppression. In South Africa, a teacher used his story to teach about resilience during apartheid. In India, activists referenced him when fighting for the rights of marginalized communities. In Europe, students drew parallels between his stand and their own battles against discrimination. His desk had become a symbol, not just of Black dignity, but of universal human worth. And yet, amid the widespread recognition, the story remained most powerful at its core: intimate, personal, human. Generations of Black families told it around dinner tables, reminding their children and grandchildren of the price their ancestors had paid to claim space. For them, the story was not abstract history. It was lived reality. It was a reminder that the world would sometimes try to push them aside, but that they carried within themselves the strength to stand. One evening, years after David's passing, his granddaughter Maya found herself facing her own test. She had just started her career as a journalist, and she had been assigned to cover a story about racial profiling in her city. But when she presented her draft, her editor dismissed it, saying, "This angle is too sensitive. Let's not stir things up. Maybe write about something lighter." Maya felt a wave of anger and discouragement. Part of her wanted to quietly accept the decision to avoid conflict. But then she remembered her grandfather's words, remembered the stories she had heard since childhood. Don't move. The next morning, she returned to her editor and said calmly, "With respect, I can't change this story. It matters, and it deserves to be told." She braced herself for backlash, but instead the editor paused, studied her, and finally nodded. "All right, let's run it." The article was published and went on to spark dialogue across the city. And when Maya later reflected on her decision, she smiled through tears. "I didn't move, Grandpa," she whispered. David's story also shaped faith communities. In churches, pastors preached his legacy as a reminder of God-given worth. In mosques, imams referenced his stand as an example of patience and dignity under pressure. In synagogues, rabbis told it alongside stories of resilience from their own tradition. Across different faiths and cultures, the desk became a metaphor for spiritual integrity, the idea that no one could strip away the divine image within each person. Eventually, the very university where David had once faced humiliation created a permanent memorial in his honor. In the main courtyard, they placed a bronze sculpture of a simple desk and chair. At the base of the sculpture was an inscription. Here sat a student who refused to move. May we all learn from his courage. The unveiling ceremony was attended by students, faculty, alumni, and community members. As the cover was pulled back, silence fell across the crowd. Some wept. Others stood straighter, as though the desk itself reminded them of their own dignity. That memorial became a pilgrimage site for students of all backgrounds. Many left flowers or notes on the desk, messages like, "Because of you, I stayed in school," or "Your courage gave me mine." And every year, on the anniversary of his stand, the university held a ceremony, not as a reminder of shame, but as a celebration of growth and justice. In the decades that followed, David's story became part of the fabric of culture itself. Writers penned novels inspired by his courage. Poets wrote verses that echoed his grandmother's wisdom. Musicians composed songs that told of dignity unshaken. His name appeared in textbooks, his story in documentaries, his image in murals. Yet through all the retellings, the heart of the story remained the same. One student, one desk, one decision not to move. And so generations later, when children faced bullying, when students confronted discrimination, when communities stood against injustice, they repeated the mantra passed down through time. Don't move. It was more than resistance, it was affirmation. It meant I belong here. I am enough. I will not be erased. And somewhere beyond time, David's spirit surely smiled. For the desk was never just about him. It was about everyone who would come after, everyone who needed to know that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken away. By the time David's story reached its 7th decade of retelling, it no longer belonged to a single community, city, or even nation. It had become part of the global tapestry of human rights. His desk, once an ordinary piece of school furniture, was now a symbol, studied in classrooms from New York to Nairobi, whispered in activist circles in London, and recited in protest chants in São Paulo. Across languages and continents, the refrain remained the same: don't move. World leaders, too, found themselves citing the story in speeches. At the United Nations, a delegate from Ghana referenced David when addressing a summit on educational equity, declaring the measure of justice in a society is whether every child has the right to sit and to stay seated where knowledge is shared. The chamber erupted in applause, and David's name appeared in headlines across the globe once more. In South America, a coalition of student activists fighting against systemic barriers adopted his image as part of their campaign logo, a silhouette of a young man seated at a desk, unflinching, surrounded by rays of light. For them, the story was not just about race, it was about power, belonging, and the universal human right to dignity. "This is our brother in courage," they declared. "He shows us how to stand even when sitting." Meanwhile, in Africa, educators began to use the story as part of leadership training. At universities in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, students discussed David's refusal to move as a model of nonviolent resistance. Professors encouraged their students to think not only about the desk, but about the greater structures of inequality that still demanded courage. "The desk is a metaphor," one professor told her students. "It represents every place where someone is told they don't belong. What you do in that moment defines not only your life, but the world's future." Artists continued to keep the story alive. Painters depicted the scene with bold strokes, the stern face of the racist man, the calm defiance in David's eyes, the quiet thunder of a student who would not yield. Sculptors created modern interpretations, some abstract, some painfully literal. In one European exhibition, a life-sized installation of a bronze desk and chair invited visitors to sit, to feel the weight of history, and to ask themselves, would I move? Musicians, too, found inspiration. A young hip-hop artist in Chicago wrote an entire album titled The Desk, blending beats with spoken word poetry about courage, belonging, and legacy. The songs resonated with millions, particularly young listeners, who often felt marginalized in their schools and communities. The chorus of one track became a rallying cry. "My seat is mine, my voice divine, I won't move this time," because dignity never dies. It only waits for someone to claim it again. And so the legacy of David, the boy who once refused to move from a desk, will live forever. In classrooms, in streets, in hearts, in every place where someone is told they don't belong. His story is the echo that answers back, "I belong. I will not move." Legacies are not measured by statues or by books alone. They are measured in the quiet ways lives are changed, in the choices people make when no one is watching. David's story proved that truth again and again. Even after the memorials were built, after the textbooks were written, after the murals had faded under sun and rain, the desk still lived, not in wood or bronze, but in memory, in spirit, in the unshakable courage of those who carried it forward. Generations after David's passing, his name was still spoken in reverence. Yet what mattered most was not his name, but the lesson. Children who had never heard of the man himself still lived by his principle. When they were told to shrink, they stood taller. When they were told to leave, they stayed. When they were told they didn't belong, they claimed their place with quiet resolve. They may not have known David's face, but they knew his truth. And isn't that the true power of legacy? That it becomes bigger than the person who began it. That it no longer needs to be tied to a single life, but flows like a river through countless others. The world, of course, continued to wrestle with injustice. Racism did not vanish. Prejudice did not die. There were still moments when hate hissed across classrooms, boardrooms, and streets. But each time, those who stood against it carried a deeper awareness. They were not alone. They were part of a long line, a great unbroken chain of those who had refused to move. David had simply added one more link to that chain, one more voice to the chorus that said, "We belong." In the decades that followed, there were new leaders, new voices, new stories of courage. Some stood on podiums, some marched in streets, some whispered their truth only to themselves. But all of them, in some way, echoed the stillness of the desk. All of them carried its wisdom, that dignity is not a gift handed down. It is a birthright lived out. And so in living rooms and classrooms, in courtrooms and churches, people kept returning to that one story, retelling it, reshaping it, breathing it into new generations. Imagine a teacher 50 years from now, looking at her students, children from every race, every background, sitting side by side. She begins to tell them the story of a young Black student who once faced a man's hatred and answered not with violence, but with stillness. The children listen, wide-eyed. Some feel tears prick their eyes without knowing why, and when she finishes, she leans forward and says, "Someday, each of you will have a desk. Maybe not in a classroom, Maybe not made of wood, but a place where you must decide whether to stay or to move. Remember him. Remember what he chose. The children nod. And just like that, the legacy lives again. There will always be those who doubt stories like David's, who shrug and say, it was just one man, one moment. What difference does it really make? But history answers them. One woman refusing to move on a bus sparked a movement. One student sitting at a lunch counter shook the conscience of a nation. And one boy refusing to move from a desk rippled across time until it touched the hearts of millions. The lesson is not that one act changes the world instantly. The lesson is that one act can plant a seed. And when seeds are planted in the soil of courage, they grow into forests strong enough to shelter generations. David's desk was one such seed, and now the forest stands tall. For the Black community, the story became more than inspiration. It became affirmation. It declared without apology that belonging was never conditional. It was permanent. It was sacred. It was not up for debate. For others, immigrants, refugees, women, workers, anyone ever told to sit down and stay quiet, it became a universal metaphor. Wherever someone was silenced, they remembered the desk. Wherever someone was erased, they remembered the desk. Wherever someone was pressured to disappear, they remembered the desk. And so the desk became eternal, woven not just into Black history, not just into American history, but into human history. Sometimes late at night, people who carried the story would whisper it like a prayer. Don't move, not in fear, not in shame, not in hate, but in truth, in dignity, in love. And perhaps that is where David's story ultimately leads, not to anger, not even to victory, but to love. A love fierce enough to defend dignity, a love wide enough to claim belonging, a love strong enough to teach the world, generation after generation, that every child has a place, every voice has a seat, every soul has worth. David's name may fade in centuries to come. The bronze desk may gather dust, the murals may chip, the books may be forgotten on library shelves, but the lesson will outlive them all. For as long as there are people willing to stand or sit for their dignity, David's story will never die. It will live in every heart that whispers, in moments of doubt and fear, I belong here. I will not move. There comes a moment in every great story when the echoes finally settle, when the last word is spoken, when the lesson crystallizes into something that cannot be forgotten. For David's story, that moment is not about endings at all. It is about continuation. Because what began at one desk so many years ago is not bound by time nor by place. It lives on in the quiet courage of those who hear it and decide, in their own lives, to do the same. The world may move on, building new schools, writing new laws, painting new murals. Generations may forget the details of who David was, where he lived, or even the exact day he made his stand. But they will never forget the principle. They will never forget the truth that he embodied. Dignity is not negotiable. Belonging is not conditional. And courage, even silent courage, can change the world. One day, perhaps centuries from now, a child will sit in a classroom where her classmates laugh at her accent, or mock the color of her skin, or dismiss her ideas. She will feel the weight of shame pressing her down. But then she will remember the story, perhaps told to her by a teacher, perhaps read in a book, perhaps whispered like an old legend. She will sit taller. She will refuse to move. And in that refusal, David will live again. Another day, on another continent, a young man will walk into a workplace where he is told he does not belong. He will hear the same cruel words that echo across generations. And when the pressure comes to step aside, to give up his place, he too will remember. And he will stay. And in his stillness, David will live again. That is the nature of true legacy. It does not end with the man, nor with the telling of his story. It is reborn every time someone chooses courage over fear, dignity over surrender, truth over silence. And so the desk becomes not a piece of furniture in the past, but a symbol for the present, for the future, for every human heart. A reminder that each of us at some point will face our own test. Each of us will have a desk, a place where the world demands we move. And in that moment, our choice will matter, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after. David's story teaches us that courage is contagious. One refusal can spark 1,000. One stand can inspire a generation. One act of dignity can outlive centuries. So when the time comes for you, yes, you, to face your desk, remember him. Remember the young Black student who was told to move and who chose not to. Remember the weight of his grandmother's words. Stand tall. Never move from your dignity. Remember that hate may shout, but dignity can stand silent and unshaken. And when you remember, you will know what to do. Do not move, because the desk is yours. The place is yours. The world, with all its cruelty, cannot take from you what is already yours by right. In the end, David's story is not only about race or history or even education. It is about humanity. It is about the eternal truth that each of us is worthy. Each of us belongs. Each of us has the right to sit at the table of life without apology. The classroom is gone. The man who spat hatred is gone. Even David himself has passed. But the lesson remains. It always will. So let us honor it. Let us carry it. Let us live it. And when the world tells us to move, let us answer with the unshakable truth. I will not move. I belong. That is the end of David's story, and the beginning of ours.